After Joshua comes Judges. What is a judge in the sense of these judges? Not Judge Judy, what these judges? They what? Well, no, not exactly. They are usually military leaders, and the judging has more to do with carrying out God's judgment, I think. I think it is God's judgment against Israel's enemies. But ordinarily you'd think, judge has to do with the law and interpreting the law. And that's kind of the same way in the New Testament. You see a lawyer, you'd think they're a lawyer that argues cases in court, but they don't. They just are experts in the old law. After Joshua dies, the Israelites ask God, who shall go up first against the Canaanites? And who did God say should go up first? Judah. Judah should go up first. And so what does Judah do? Okay, they go to Simeon, the tribe of Simeon, and what do they say to them? You help us, we'll help you. Is there anything wrong with that arrangement? God doesn't seem to be bothered by it, so I guess it's okay. They would have found that maybe if they hadn't. And so apparently God is okay with it. And so I guess it's okay to ask our brother for help or our sister for help. If we face an enemy and we'd like to have somebody there with us, it's okay to ask a brother or sister.
Maybe it depends on the kind of help they will offer.
What's that?
It depends on the kind of help they will offer.
Yeah, it depends on the help and the realization that in the end it's neither one of you that's going to do it, it's God doing it. But sometimes if two of us are working together, helping each other and encourage one another as God does what needs to be done, then that's a benefit. And they very quickly go up against the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and they defeat 10,000 men. They find a king, Adonai-Bezek, and they defeat him. And what do they do to him? They cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Why would they do that? Now, one reason is he has done it to 70 other kings, so it seemed like a good idea. Yeah, what are you going to do without a thumb? You'd be amazed how useful thumbs are. And you'd be amazed how useful big toes are. And so by just removing his thumbs and big toes, that was a pretty big offense to him. No, you can't handle a weapon. You can't. What? You can't do dishes. Yeah, without your thumb, you can't do dishes. You have to have a husband to help do dishes and things like that. It does. It makes it really hard to hitchhike. We can think of all sorts of things that happen if you don't have a thumb. But you'd be amazed at what a difference it makes to just have the thumbs and your big toes. It's kind of hard for balance. You're certainly not going to be running anywhere. You're not going to be able to do much hand-to-hand combat without your thumbs or toes, for sure. Turned his toes into thumbs. I guess thumbs are more important than toes, probably. They fight against Jerusalem and they capture it and they set the city on fire. We'll find out later on that's not really the whole story, but they do capture Jerusalem and set it on fire. And then they go fight against the Canaanites. And that Kirioth that keeps showing up, Kirioth Arba in verse 10, and in verse 11, Kirioth Sefer. Kirioth has to do with the word for city. It has to do with a floor or a house or a city. And so that's why that one prefix keeps popping up, because it's the city of something or other. And as they go up against the inhabitants of Debir, Caleb makes an offer. And what offer does he make?
Whoever captures the city,
Whoever captures this city,
you'll give his daughter.
I will give him my daughter for a wife. And who stepped up? Othniel. And we'll find him later on in chapter 3. That would be a good name. Let's write that down somewhere. Yeah. And that's about where we would start, wouldn't it? With Othniel. The daughter wants a little bit more, though. What does she want to get? Needs some water, too. Give me some springs to go with the land. He gave her the upper and lower springs. And then in verse 16, the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went from the city of palms with the sons of Judah. What's the city of palms? Palm Springs. Somebody said it right. Jericho. Jericho. Back in Deuteronomy, it's referred to as the city of palms. And a number of times in the book of Judges, not a whole lot of times, but when it's referred to in the book of Judges, it's referred to as the city of palms. And in Joshua chapter 6, he pronounces that curse against Jericho. You remember that? After they have defeated Jericho. And in Joshua 6:26, Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates." And so they pronounced that curse against Jericho. And I don't know if that's why they didn't like to use the name Jericho after that. Instead of using the name of the cursed city, they just said, "Oh, the city of palms." I don't know. And then Judah goes with Simeon as they have arranged, and they take some of the other areas. But in verse 19, the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But what could they not do? They could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. Why? They had iron chariots. How much of an excuse is that really? It's not, because an iron chariot is no obstacle for God. It was not God's lack of ability that kept them from driving out the people with the iron chariots. It was their lack of faith. If they would have had trust in God and faith, they would not have had trouble with the people with the iron chariots. And in verse 21, although verse 8 talks about Judah taking Jerusalem, that's not quite the whole story, because Jerusalem's actually in the territory of Benjamin. It's right on the borderline of the territory of Judah, but it's actually in the territory of Benjamin. And what does verse 21 tell us? They did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, and so they didn't drive out the inhabitants. And they lived with the sons of Jerusalem the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to that day. And if you go over to 2 Samuel chapter 5, or beginning in verse 6, David and his army arrive at Jerusalem, and what do the Jebusites say? You're not going to come in here. Even the blind and lame could turn you back. You're not going to capture this city. Just anybody could stop you from going in there. And so David did capture the city. But that's clear over there in 2 Samuel when they finally decided to take possession of the town. So the Judges chapter 1 doesn't tell the whole story. They allowed the inhabitants to stay there, and they eventually, looks like they took back over because they allowed them to stay. In verse 27, Manasseh doesn't take possession of Bethshean. And there's a list of villages and towns there that they did not take possession of. So the Canaanites continued to live in the land. And when Israel became strong, they made them forced laborers, but they did not drive them out completely. And in verse 29, what happens? Ephraim does not drive out the Canaanites living in that area. Verse 30. Zebulun does not drive out the inhabitants of that area. In verse 31. The Asherites do not drive out the people of that area. Verse 33. Naphtha did not drive out the people in that area.
You know what I don't understand about this? If they were strong enough to put them into forced labor, then why wasn't it strong enough to drive them out?
Yeah.
That's what I don't
Yeah,
understand.
there must have been a lack of willpower there. If they did have the strength to turn them into forced laborers, why didn't they have the strength to just defeat them? I mean, they defeated them to make them forced laborers. I don't know. But I think it was probably a lack of willpower to do what God had told them to do. They just probably didn't see the importance of it. In the last few verses of that chapter 1, the Amorites actually have the upper hand in the area of Dan up north. And they wouldn't even allow them to come down into the valley, made them stay up in the hills. And so how would you describe the situation in chapter 1 of Judges? If you had to just summarize. They kind of did what God told them to do. And they kind of didn't do what God told them to do.
You know, you wonder, with Judah and Simeon, you wonder if they had great success there for a while, and then you wonder if they just started depending on themselves rather than God, and just, and then on it went bad for them because they wasn't trusting in God, they was trusting in themselves.
That's definitely a danger. As we experience success at God's hand, we might be tempted to think that we're the ones that are doing it. Hey, I've done a pretty good job with this.
You know, when Achan did that business with Ai, was with Jericho.
Yeah.
And then they lost to Ai, and then all his temple was destroyed. They didn't ever do that again.
No, that's one thing they didn't repeat.
They didn't repeat it. They saw what happened to Achan.
Yeah.
And it's like, everybody was probably saying, well, we didn't drive them all out. We're fine.
Yeah. Yeah, we're okay. And I just really think they did not feel the importance of doing exactly what God said to do, the way God said to do it. And there's a big lesson for us today, because there are a lot of people who really feel no need to do what God says to do the way God says to do it. It's just not that critical. It's not that important. We're making a big deal out of it. Let's just let it go. And I think that was don't you think that was their attitude? Because if something is truly important to you, of primary importance, you're going to focus on it and do it. And they just didn't do it. And so in chapter 2, an angel comes to them. And it's the angel speaking, but it's God speaking. An angel is a messenger. And so it's God speaking through the angel. So the angel speaks, but it's God who's speaking. And what does God say through the angel? Okay, I did what I promised. I took you out of Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt just as I promised. I led you into the land that I promised to your fathers. I promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that their descendants would have this land. And I will never break my covenant with you. But what did it say about them? As for you, I told you to not make any covenant with the people in the land. Don't make peace with them. You're to tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. Yeah, we did, about 65% maybe. You did not do it. You did not tear down their altars. You made covenants with them, so you have not obeyed me. And
These are the same ones, probably, that said, Joshua, no, we'll
oh, I think they're the same people that said, we will follow you. You go back to that little discourse they had with Joshua. He said, you're not going to do it. And they said, oh, yeah, we will obey God. And I'm pretty sure they're the same people who said that. I don't know what to do with that last question in verse 2. If God were to ask us the same question. What is this you have done? I'm just not sure what we would do with that question if God were asking us that question and not the Israelites. What is this you have done? And God continues. I said, I will not drive them out. You know, they're going to become thorns in your sides, and their gods are going to be a snare for you. If they would have driven them out completely and totally destroyed their gods, things would have gone differently. But they let them hang on, and so their gods are going to become a snare to them. And so in verse 4, they start weeping because the angel said that to them. They would lift up their voices and wept. In fact, they named the place Weepers. That's why they named the place Weepers. And they sacrificed to God. So luckily they have repented. They have turned around. They have dedicated themselves totally to following God. Joshua dismissed them earlier, and they went to their inheritance. And in verse 7, how long had the people, he's kind of going backward here in time, but how long had the people been faithful? During the times of Joshua and the leaders of the land who survived him, the ones who had seen what God had done. And he died at age 110. They buried him. And then all that generation, one by one, they died off in verse 10 until there was another generation that what? Did not know the Lord. Why didn't they know the Lord? Yeah, I guess nobody taught them. What'd you say, Tracy?
Nobody taught it.
Yeah, nobody taught it. They didn't have to see the dividing of the Red Sea. They didn't have to see the dividing of the Jordan River. They didn't have to walk across the Jordan River or the Red Sea or eat the manna to know God. It was somebody's job to teach them to know God. And so they didn't know God, and they didn't know the work that he had done for Israel. Somebody just didn't bother to teach them. And so what did they do? They start serving the Baals. They forsake God, the one who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed other gods. They bowed down to those other gods, and they forsook Jehovah and served Baal and the Ashtartes. What did God do in response? God's anger burns against them, and he turns them into the hand of what are called plunderers and their enemies. Sold them into the hands of their enemies, and they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them, as the Lord had spoken. And then in verse 16, then what would happen? God would raise up a judge or judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them, but what? Then they would be right back where they started, following other gods, turned aside. In verse 17, how long did it take them to turn aside? Is your word quickly in there? They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. And so God would raise up judges, and he was with the judge. And the people during the days of the judge. And then in verse 19, what would happen? When the judge died, they started acting how? More corruptly. And so they just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
Gary, was talking about the judges earlier about not necessarily being, I can't remember how you said it, somehow not necessarily teachers of the law or whatever. It must have been, some of them anyway, must have been good, God-fearing people, and some of them anyway tried to according to what you can read here,
Yeah.
they tried to steer them the right way, keep them going the right way. But one of the verses says here, but they didn't listen to the judges.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the judges tried.
from that there was some
Yeah, the judges tried to teach them what they should be doing as far as obeying God.
to keep them on the right path.
Yeah. And isn't verse 19 of chapter 2 just a sad, sad chapter? Chapter, it's a verse. That when the judge died, they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. And finally, God says in verse 20, I'm not going to keep on doing this, and I'm just going to leave these nations in to test you and see if you're going to choose to follow God or follow me. And so God allowed those nations to remain. And that sets the pattern for the whole book of Judges. And down at the bottom of your sheet, there's a cycle that takes place in the book of Judges. And what would be the first step in the cycle? The disobedience. They disobey God. They serve other gods. It just depends on where you start in the cycle. It all comes back around in a circle. But they begin by being disobedient to God and bowing down to other gods. And so what's the next step? Well, before that, there's one step before they cry out. God sends an oppressor. And so they disobey God, so God sends an oppressor. And then the third thing that happens is they cry out to God. And then verse 4, the fourth one is God sends a deliverer. And so they disobey God, God sends an oppressor, they cry out to God, and God sends a deliverer. And then the next thing, what's that? And that comes back around, but the first thing that happens is they defeat the oppressor. God raises up a judge, the judge defeats the oppressor, and number 6 is they obey God as long as that judge is alive. And then you go back to number 1, and they disobey God, God sends an oppressor, they cry out, God sends a deliverer, they defeat their enemy, they obey God as long as that judge is alive, and then they disobey God, and then God sends an oppressor, and it's just a cycle that goes over and over and over in the book of Judges. And that's what's being described there in that chapter 2. In chapter 3, it starts to list some of the nations that God left in order to test the Israelites. What does it mean they left them to test them? See what their decision is going to be, whether they're going to continue to follow him or follow after idols. And so those nations remained. And in verse 3, the Philistines, there were 5 cities of the Philistines, and they remained. And that's where Goliath came from, all of those that were oppressing Israel during the time of David there when he had to defeat Goliath. Those were the Philistines. They're the ones that captured the Ark of the Covenant, took it, and were really sorry they did. The Canaanites, the Sidonians, which would be way up north, the Hivites. And so a lot of the local people were still there. And it explains in verse 4 that they were to find out if they're going to obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. It's a little bit hard maybe to find out whether we would really follow God without times of testing. And when the chips are down, what would our decision be? It's easy to be fair weather Christians when things are going fine, and but you just wonder what the difference would be. I should have printed off some. I ran across a website today that has statistics of things that are going on in the world. How many Christians are being killed every hour? How many? It's pretty sad statistics. I'm using Christian in a generic sense, but we really don't know what oppression is. But there are countries, and North Korea is number one on the list, the most oppressive place for Christians. There are places around the world where it'd be very dangerous to be a Christian.
I was reading something about China.
China was pretty high on the list.
Reading something just recently about
Yeah, China was pretty high on the list. North Korea was number one. I don't remember what all the others were, but in a lot of the world, it's not very popular to be a Christian.
Well, I think even here, maybe for at least for some folks, maybe it's a matter of choosing God or relationships.
Yeah, and we often face those decisions, and I think it's unfortunately, or maybe I don't know, it's changing in the United States where it's becoming less and less popular to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Because the way society is going, it's just becoming very, very unpopular to be a Christian.
Because we have the scripture too that tells us, where people had turned to God and the people that they used to hang out with are surprised that they no longer do those things.
Yeah,
So there's a possibility that we might have to lose those relationships.
yeah. And so I guess the question for us is this progresses and we find ourselves more and more in the situation of the Israelites, where they were surrounded more and more by all these other influences, what is our choice going to be? What's our decision going to be? Are we going to choose to remain faithful to God, or are we going to give in and bow down to the modern gods around us?
I think it's kind of relieving, though, for me, because, like, in the time of Elijah, when no one was doing anything right, or when, and Daniel, like, he would bow down to the idol, or if he was going to go out and pray anyway. Like, when you're a follower of God in those times where it's extremely unpopular to be a follower of God, there is no one out there that's faking being a follower of God.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So, like, as Christianity becomes less and less popular, you're going to have more and more people be like, you know what, I'm going to be honest, I've been faking it for a while, and they're not going to claim to be Christians anymore, and it makes it that much easier to get the clear message of Christianity out.
Yeah, that's what we would hope, and there's definitely an opportunity in persecution for it to have a positive, for those who remain faithful. It can be a very positive thing, not a pleasant thing, but a positive thing. To have an opportunity to take a stand, and as you say, to sort things out from people who are just fair weather Christians and people who are truly devoted to God, and so that's right. But it's easy for us to look back at the Israelites and be critical of the choices they made, and they just didn't drive out the enemy. It wasn't important to get rid of them. They just coexisted with them, and it's easy to criticize them. But when we turn it in on ourselves and see how that applies to us today, we have a little bit different viewpoint, I think. But we need to look very carefully at God's reaction to this. and it's not good. And so they, in verse 7, well, actually beginning in verse 6, what did they do with these neighboring countries? They married, their sons married their daughters, and their daughters married their sons, and they worshiped their gods. Had God not been specific? Had he not been clear enough? What did he specifically say not to do? Do not intermarry with them. Do not have your sons marry their daughters, and do not let your daughters marry their sons. Period. He really, really was not unclear with that. And he wasn't unclear about the part about bowing down to their gods either. But this is just so specific. And so what do? They intermarry and bow down to their gods. And the consequence in verse 7 was they forgot Jehovah, and they turned to the Baals and the Asherah. And those are both kind of generic gods. Baal means Lord, and Asherah is the female deity. But every little different area had their own versions, and so it's not like one Baal and one Asherah, but there were just a whole bunch of them.
You know, you go back to the first part of the chapter there, whenever it says that there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord nor work the other Israel. And I think probably the reason why is what they were doing was intermarrying and worshiping their gods. So the true God was not being spoke about anymore. There wasn't anybody teaching anything about God, because they were doing they were intermarrying and worshiping the other gods, and that's why the generation that came after didn't know the Lord.
Sure. If you're intermarrying with these other nations, you're not going to be teaching that Jehovah is the one God. What happened to Solomon? His wives turned him away from God. He built temples for their gods and altars for their gods. Do you know of anybody who started out with a more direct relationship with God than Solomon? I mean, they were conversing, and Solomon was making the right choices, and God was rewarding him for making the right choices, and they got off to a great start. And the one thing that turned Solomon away from God was he married a whole bunch of foreign wives, and they led his heart astray. And so he would build altars to their gods and temples to their gods, and that's all it took, was just all those wives. And so God turns them over to the king of Mesopotamia, and they served him for 8 years. And then what did they do? They cried out. So here's step 3. Number 1, they disobeyed God. Number 2, God sent the oppressor. Number 3, they cry out to God. And number 4, verse 9, God raises up a deliverer for them. And who is the deliverer that God raises up? Here's Othniel, Caleb's son-in-law. He is the son of his younger brother, but isn't he the same one we saw earlier?
According to this, what this says is he's the
Son of Caleb's younger brother, but he was also the husband of Caleb's younger daughter. So he was a nephew who was also a son-in-law. Things were different back then. And since God raised him up as a deliverer, the Spirit of God came upon him, and he judged Israel and goes out to war. Verse 10 is another one of those famous Bible battles. Somebody describe the battle to me. Well, this army went this way, and this other army went this way, and this one flanked the other one, and then they sent another charge. And isn't that how most battles go? It starts and is over. If God's involved, the battle starts, the battle's over, and God wins. It's not like any human war I've ever read about, with all the different strategies and everything that went on to win the battle. And so Othniel defeats the king of Mesopotamia. And then what happens in verse 11? They have 40 years of peace, and then he dies. So we've come full circle. They've disobeyed God. God sent an oppressor. They cried out to God. God sent a deliverer. They defeated their enemy, and they remained faithful to God throughout the life of that judge. And then, verse 12. They again did evil in the sight of God, and so God sent an oppressor, the king of Moab. And he possessed the city of the palm trees, and the people served him for 18 years. And then in verse 15, they cry out to God. And so God sends Ehud. And what does it say about Ehud? He's left-handed. He must have been a good guy. Yep. And there's a reason why that's significant here. You run into places where it talks about some of the soldiers who could use either hand, and then some of them who were left-handed. And there's probably a reason why that's significant for a warrior. It's significant sometimes in baseball just because of what is expected and what happens. And in war, you're trained fighting somebody who's right-handed. And your whole defense and your whole attack is based on a right-handed person, and some lefty comes along and just really throws everything out. And so it's, especially in what happens here, it's significant that he was left-handed. They had to send tribute to this king. And so the Israelites sent their tribute to the king by this judge. Describe the king, Eglon, to me. He was morbidly obese. He was a very fat man, it says. Through most of history, being fat was symbolic of being really rich. Most people did not have enough food to become fat on. Only the very rich could indulge in eating too much. And so Ehud brought the tribute, and he sent away the people who had helped carry the tribute to the king. And he went back to the king, and what did he say to the king? I have a secret message for you. And the king said, shh, don't tell anybody. And so the king sent everybody out. And Ehud came to him while he was sitting out on the chamber on the roof. And he said, I have a message from where? I have a message from God for you. And I think it's Eglon in verse 20 that rises from his seat. And what does Ehud do? He pulls out that sword, that two-edged sword that he had hidden. And he took the sword into his hand and he drove it into Eglon's belly. And the sword disappeared, basically.
You know, he made it a cubit long, which is about a foot and a half.
Yeah.
Plus the handle. That's
Yeah, yeah, cubit's 18 inches, and so it's this long, and plus probably the handle, and that went all the way in him, and the fat closed over the blade, and he didn't even pull it out, and he had closed the doors and locked them and headed out. They might have done an autopsy to try to find the cause of death.
With an X-ray.
Yeah. It's one of those where it's fairly obvious what happened here. If you watch any of those shows on television, the police officer will say, ask for a cause of death, and the coroner will say, well, I can't tell you until I get him on the slab. I mean, they may be decapitated, but the coroner says, I can't tell you the cause of death till I get him on the slab. He could have had a heart attack. He might have been dead by the time the sword went in. He died because God sent him a message by Ehud. Finally, when the servants came, first of all, they figured he was just resting. And then they got worried, and they finally opened the doors to the chamber, and then they saw him on the floor dead. Meanwhile, Ehud had escaped, and as soon as he went back home, what did he do? He blew the horn in the hill country of Ephraim. People came down from the hill country, and what did he tell them? Pursue them, follow them. The Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. And so they went down and seized the fords of the Jordan so they couldn't escape. And they struck down how many? 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. Why couldn't they do this before? Because they weren't relying on God. They weren't obeying God. God was not with them. And so they could not do anything with this enemy before because they weren't following God, obeying God. And here again, what kind of a battle is there? The enemy turns and runs. And there's not a battle where two armies face each other. The Israelites come in and the Moabites run and head out. And they just have to try to keep them from escaping. And so they subdue Moab, and how long do they have peace? For 80 years. The third judge, there's not a very long, Chuck.
I was going to say, makes you wonder. I mean, he had, he comes down and he blows the horn and he says, the Lord's given them into our hands. And you wonder, why do they believe him at this time? Why do they believe him now? And they didn't do anything before, you would think that there would have been people trying to rally him from time to time, saying, hey, look, but we wouldn't listen.
Yeah, you would hope there would have been people
For some
trying.
reason or another, at this time, they listened to him. They did what he said, and they trusted in God.
And God may have been the reason for that. Might have been God. But one of the reasons they might have followed him this time is because the enemy was running. If the enemy is facing you with their army, you might be kind of chicken. But if the enemy is running as fast as they can to escape, and somebody calls and says, "Hey, come help us chase them," then that might be enough. I don't know. But now, one thing about the book of Judges, we don't know for sure if the judges are all sequential. We don't know if there are some overlaps in the judges, that some of them had multiple judges dealing with different enemies, overlapping time. And so we don't know that you had one judge and then period, and then another judge, and then a period, then another judge, and then a period. Here it sounds as if Shamgar followed Ehud from verse 31. But there's only, Shamgar's judging is about one verse long. And what does it say about Shamgar? That he struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. And that might have also still been during the lifetime of Ehud, because chapter 4 begins how? After Ehud died, they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Jesse? Yep. All he needed was a sharp stick. And yeah, it's just like a pointed stick. It's to poke an animal to make it move. And that's really kind of amazing. But you start reading some of the people like David's mighty men and the things that they accomplished, or you just look at Samson, or you look at Jonathan and his armor bearer. And just occasionally we run into things like this where one person is able to defeat a huge number of people. But it's not because he was good at sharp sticks. It's because God's good at sharp sticks. And so that's why he was able to defeat that many people with an ox goad. What's that? Yeah, I couldn't hit a snake with a sharp stick. I've tried. But no, it's one of those things that's really impressive. But he only did it because God was with him and gave him that ability to kill that many people. And so we're off to a good start on the book of Judges.
Talks about Moab being subdued. The land was undisturbed for 80 years. Probably, possibly that Ehud wasn't. That's a long time.
Yeah, we don't know how old Ehud was, whether that was the rest of his life. But, verse 1 of chapter 4 does indicate that when he died, they disobeyed God. And so he may have lived another 80 years. We don't know. And so what lessons can we learn from these first chapters of Judges? Nothing in here that really applies to us. Tracy?
I think if the Israelites had done what Moses told them back in Deuteronomy 6 about you shall teach them diligently when you walk, and when you're sitting down, when you lie down, when you rise up. And they didn't communicate and tell their children these stories and emphasize God's providence and God's protection and care.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and beginning in verse 4, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And then you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your might." And then they are to be on your heart. But then in verse 7, what does he say? You shall teach them diligently to your sons and daughters, and shall talk of them when you sit on your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So, if that would have taken place, would we have read the verse that says another generation arose that did not know the Lord? How many times have we seen so far that they would set up a monument so that when their children asked, and when they had the Passover, part of the point of what they did at the Passover, so when their children asked, why are we doing this? They would say, because God delivered us from Egypt with his mighty hand, and these are the things that he did. Or the altar on the west side of the Jordan, or other stones that they set up, the stone that Joshua set up as a witness. But one of the main purposes was so that when their children ask, "What is this?" they would tell them. And if a generation arises that does not know God, whose fault is it? Is it the children's fault? It's the parents' fault. It's not the children's fault for not learning something that was never taught to them. And so if a generation arises that does not know God, it is the fault of the adults who should have taught them.
That doesn't mean that the children, as they get to be adults, can seek.
And the children are free to make their choices, good, bad, or whatever. But it probably can't be said that they don't know God. Therein lies our lesson for today. As if that might. Yeah. Yes, us, yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Therein lies the responsibility of making sure that nobody says that of the next generation coming along. Yeah. There was that was it on Facebook? There were those little children, kindergartners or preschool or something, saying a prayer, or what was it they were doing? And they were praying, and one of the comments was brainwashed, because these children were they were meeting before school to say a prayer, and one of the comments was brainwashed. Well, if that's kind of brainwashing, then let's go for it. Let's teach our children. Let's, yeah, let's teach them what the Bible says. Not to force the decision on them, but so they'll have the right information to make the right decision. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so let's just make sure that nobody says that of the next generation, that they did not know God or the great things God had done. Let's just make sure that's not said, because it'll fall on us. It's our responsibility. Thank you very much.